Amelia Grant stood before the cameras as the cold, untouchable executive who needed no one, the kind of leader board members whispered about and rivals feared. No one inside the company knew the quiet janitor mopping the 43rd floor every night was her lawful husband. Mason Reed had accepted the lowest position in the building to protect their marriage and keep his dangerous past from her world. But the night kidnappers dragged Amelia from her private garage, every careful lie collapsed at once. The man everyone overlooked stepped out of the shadows, carrying skills that made hardened criminals afraid. Rain fell over Manhattan on the night Grant Meridian Group announced a merger worth billions, and every camera in the room turned toward the woman who had built her name on never needing anyone. Amelia Grant stood at the podium in a charcoal suit, her voice steady, her expression carved from something colder than confidence. The press called her the unmarried titan, the woman who answered to no man and bowed to no board, a portrait she had spent 2 years perfecting in front of exactly the wrong audience. Behind that podium, behind the careful posture and the rehearsed smile, she carried a secret heavy enough to end everything she had built, though nobody watching her that night could have guessed it existed. 43 floors above the lobby where reporters shouted questions, Mason Reed pushed a mop bucket down an empty hallway, his eyes drifting toward a television noted near the elevators. He watched her face flicker across the screen the way a man watches weather moving toward a coastline he cannot leave. Employees walked past him without a glance, the way people walk past furniture, used to seeing him there before dawn and again after midnight, a gray uniform and worn shoes blending into the architecture of the building. A few junior managers had taken to mocking his quiet habits, the way he kept his head down, the way he never seemed to want anything from anyone, mistaking his silence for emptiness rather than discipline. When the press conference ended, Amelia walked the same hallway on her way to the private elevator, and for 1/2 second her eyes found his. It was not the glance of an executive registering an employee. It was the look of a wife finding her husband in a crowded room, brief, aching, and impossible to explain to anyone watching. Mason did not smile or speak her name. He only dipped his chin the smallest amount, the gesture of any other worker acknowledging someone passing by, and continued pushing his cart toward the supply closet as though nothing in the world had passed between them. Amelia stepped into the elevator alone, and the moment the doors closed, her hands slid into the pocket of her blazer, closing around a ring she could never wear in public. The story behind that ring belonged to neither the press nor the board, a quiet ceremony 2 years earlier with no cameras, no family from either side of the company ledger, no announcement beyond 2 signatures on a marriage certificate kept in a drawer instead of a headline. Amelia had insisted on secrecy because she understood exactly how the board would use Mason against her, a young chief executive already fighting to be taken seriously, now married to a man with no university degree and no recognizable name. Mason had agreed to the secrecy for a different reason entirely, one Amelia only partly understood. He believed that the moment his name became visible beside hers, certain dangers from a life he rarely discussed would have a clear path back to her doorstep. So they built 2 separate existences inside the same 24 hours, Amelia ruling boardrooms by daylight while Mason emptied trash bins and polished glass under fluorescent light, and at night they met behind the locked door of an apartment registered under neither of their names, where the masks finally came off and 2 exhausted people remembered why they had chosen each other in the first place. It should have felt like a fortress, that secret life, 2 people protecting something precious from a world too quick to judge it. Instead, it had begun to feel, in ways neither of them said aloud, like a slow erosion, a marriage conducted entirely in whispers and stolen hallway glances. Down on the executive floor, Connor Blake had noticed something that night he could not yet name, the way Amelia's gaze had lingered half a second too long near the janitor's cart before she stepped into her elevator, a flicker so small most people would have missed it entirely. Connor did not miss it. He filed it away the way ambitious men file away every small inconsistency, certain that somewhere inside that half-second was a weakness he could eventually turn into leverage. The apartment sat on a quiet street far from the glass towers Amelia commanded by day, a small space with mismatched furniture and a kitchen too narrow for 2 people to move through comfortably. Mason had arrived home first that night, trading his gray uniform for a plain shirt, the kind of ordinary clothing that made him look like nobody in particular, which was exactly the point. When Amelia finally walked through the door in her expensive suit, exhaustion sitting on her shoulders like a second coat, he was already filling the kettle, watching her face the way he always did before either of them said a single word. He made her tea without asking too many questions, setting the cup down and studying the tension along her jaw, the particular tiredness that came from performing strength for an entire room of people who wanted to see her fail. Amelia apologized for the hallway for walking past him that afternoon, without a touch, without even a kind word passed quietly between them. Mason told her he understood, though something in his stillness suggested the understanding cost him more than he admitted. Amelia explained, not for the first time, that the board was searching for any reason to push her out of the chair her father once occupied. If they discovered she had married a janitor, they would not see love, she said. They would see proof that she lacked judgment, proof that she could be manipulated, a story ready-made for anyone wanting to dismantle her credibility in a single headline. Mason said he was not angry about being hidden. What worried him, he admitted quietly, was the creeping sense that hiding him had become easier for her than defending him, that shame and caution had started to look identical from where he stood. Amelia reacted sharply, insisting she had never once been ashamed of him, not for a single day of their marriage. Mason asked, without raising his voice, why she had never told a single person at that company the truth, not one friend, not one colleague she trusted. The question landed harder than he intended, and Amelia fell silent because she did not have an answer that did not sound like fear dressed up as strategy. She had loved him first for the quiet way he had once pulled her from a dangerous situation outside a downtown hotel, asking for nothing afterward, no recognition, no leverage, no story sold to anyone willing to pay for it. They married quickly once they understood each other, two private people who had found something rare, only for Mason to vanish for several tense weeks soon after, chased by a threat from a past he refused to fully explain. When he returned, thinner and quieter than before, he proposed they live carefully, out of sight, until whatever danger had followed him faded into nothing. Amelia agreed at the time, believing discretion was simply wisdom. Slowly, without either of them noticing the exact moment it happened, discretion had hardened into concealment, and concealment had become its own kind of cage. Mason kept the janitor's position inside her building for one simple reason. It let him stay close enough to watch over her without drawing a single curious eye. Amelia wanted, more than once, to pull him into the light, to introduce him at a company dinner, to wear her ring where people could see it. But every time she imagined that conversation with the board, with reporters, with her father's old colleagues who still measured her worth by appearances, fear won, and she told herself there would be a better year, a calmer quarter, a safer moment that never quite arrived. That night, long after Amelia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, Mason sat awake at the small kitchen table, his phone glowing faintly in the dark. An anonymous message had arrived hours earlier, words stripped of any signature. "Does she still think she can hide you?" He read it twice, then set the phone face down, and did not sleep again until morning light touched the window. The next morning, Connor Blake gathered the senior directors for an early meeting, his tone warm and his words sharpened underneath like a blade hidden in silk. He praised Amelia openly in front of everyone, calling her vision for the merger remarkable, then pivoted smoothly into concern about recent leaks of sensitive information, suggesting the chief executive herself might need closer personal protection. Amelia disliked the proposal immediately, uneasy at the thought of strangers tracking her movements through her own life. Connor introduced the man he had already selected for the role, Jason Cole, a security consultant with an impeccable resume and eyes that gave away nothing at all. Mason happened to be cleaning the glass partition just outside the conference room, catching fragments of the conversation through the door left slightly open. Jason glanced toward him with open disdain, asking aloud why a custodial worker was permitted so close to a room where strategic matters were discussed. Connor laughed lightly, remarking that men like Mason rarely understood anything happening above their pay grade, and several of the junior directors laughed along with him, comfortable in their cruelty because no one in that room imagined consequences. Amelia forced her expression into stillness, swallowing something sharp and painful, unable to defend the one person in the building who mattered most to her. Mason kept his head down and continued wiping the glass as though he had heard nothing at all, though he committed every detail to memory. Jason's posture, the earpiece tucked beneath his collar, the particular way he stood that belonged to formal training rather than ordinary private security work. After the meeting ended, Evelyn Hart found Amelia alone and warned her quietly to watch Connor carefully, noting that he had spent recent weeks quietly collecting loyalty among board members, one private conversation at a time. Amelia insisted she had the situation under control, though Evelyn reminded her that the most dangerous people rarely attacked from the front. Down in the parking garage that same afternoon, Connor met privately with Jason beside a row of executive vehicles, speaking in low, deliberate tones. Connor wanted a manufactured security crisis, something dramatic enough to make Amelia look careless and unfit to continue leading the company. Jason mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a third party wanted Amelia for reasons that went far beyond costing her the chief executive title. Connor, blinded by ambition and hungry for the chair he believed should already be his, did not ask the obvious question, did not push further into what that third party might actually want. That evening, after most of the floor had emptied, Mason returned to check the basement's security cameras during his rounds, a habit few people knew he kept. He found a gap in the footage from earlier that day, a precisely deleted segment covering the exact minutes when Connor and Jason had stood together near the garage elevators. The deletion was clean, careful, the work of someone who understood surveillance systems far better than an ordinary executive would. Mason stared at the gap in the timeline for a long moment, the quiet unease he had carried for days sharpening suddenly into something closer to certainty. He thought of the anonymous message still sitting unanswered on his phone, of Jason's trained stance near the conference room, of the way certain dangerous men learned patience long before they learned cruelty. Years of careful instinct told him this was not simply boardroom politics dressed up as ambition. Somewhere underneath Connor's petty scheming, something colder and more deliberate was beginning to move, and Mason understood that the people closest to Amelia, the ones meant to guard her, might already be working for someone else entirely. Mason came home that night carrying a tension Amelia had rarely seen in him. Something coiled and alert, the posture of a soldier listening for gunfire from a distance no one else could hear. She noticed it the moment he walked through the door, the way his eyes swept the room before he even removed his coat. He told her carefully that she should change her travel routes for the next few days, nothing more, no explanation attached. Amelia bristled immediately, hating the feeling of being managed, of being told what to do without being told why it mattered. Mason explained that Jason was not an ordinary corporate security hire, that something about his training did not match his official background. Amelia asked how he could possibly know that. Mason hesitated, then said only that he had seen men like that before, men whose stillness meant something darker than professionalism. Amelia reminded him, voice tightening, that he had never once given her the full picture of his past, not one complete story, only fragments offered when convenient and withdrawn the moment she asked for more. Mason fell quiet, saying only that some knowledge was more dangerous to carry than to live without. Tension stretched between them in a way it rarely had before, two people each guarding their own version of the truth. Amelia hiding him from the world outside their door, Mason hiding himself from her even inside it. The story beneath his silence ran deeper than either of them had spoken aloud. Years earlier, Mason had belonged to a specialized recovery unit, the kind of quiet operation built to retrieve hostages and protect high-value targets from professional kidnapping networks operating across borders. In his final mission, he had helped dismantle an entire criminal network led by a man named Xavier Cross, an operation Mason had believed closed the book on that chapter of his life for good. He had assumed Xavier was dead, or imprisoned, or simply gone, swallowed by the same darkness that consumed most men in that line of work eventually. The anonymous message proved otherwise, proof that the past he thought buried had only been sleeping. Late that night, Mason slipped down to the building's old security office, where an aging technician who once owed him a quiet debt still worked the overnight shift. Together they pulled archived footage from the surrounding streets, and Mason found what he feared. A black delivery truck appearing again and again near the building at strange hours, its license plate scrubbed clean by reflective coating designed specifically to defeat traffic cameras. This was not the work of disgruntled employees or corporate rivals settling old scores. This had the fingerprints of something far more organized, the careful patience of people who had done this kind of work before and intended to do it again. Mason sat alone in the dim glow of the monitors and sent a short message to a contact he had not spoken to in years, a man named Hunter who had once fought beside him in places neither of them discussed openly. The message read simply, "It's possible Xavier is back." Hunter's reply arrived within minutes, brief and heavy with old understanding. "If that's true, do not leave your wife alone for even a moment." Connor began circulating quiet rumors through the company that Amelia was concealing something serious, something that threatened the stability of the entire organization. Within days, several board members demanded she explain recent decisions, their questions sharper and more pointed than the situation strictly required. Lucas Grant, her father and the company's retired chairman, called to warn her that power was rarely lost through bad business decisions alone. More often it slipped away because someone else successfully rewrote the story before the person living it could speak first. Amelia said nothing to her father about Mason, afraid of the disappointment she imagined would follow, afraid he would see her secret marriage to a janitor as a failure of judgment rather than an act of love. Jason approached Amelia that afternoon, suggesting his security team escort her personally to the investor gala scheduled for that evening. Mason sent her a quiet message, warning her to avoid the private garage exit entirely. Amelia read the message while still angry with him for refusing, even now, to explain his past fully, and she let the message sit unanswered, choosing instead to trust the company's official schedule and the security plan already in motion. At the gala, beneath chandeliers and careful smiles, Connor maneuvered her into an uncomfortable position when an investor asked bluntly whether rumors of a secret relationship with a low-level employee carried any truth. Amelia held her composure, deflecting the question by insisting her private life had no bearing on her competence as a leader. The answer reached Mason through a security monitor backstage, and it struck him harder than he expected, even though he understood the impossible corner she had been pushed into. A young waiter accidentally spilled wine near Amelia's table, and Mason appeared to clean it, his presence drawing Connor's attention like a spark to dry wood. Connor made a cutting remark in front of the gathered guests, suggesting some people were simply born to lower their heads before others, and several guests laughed uneasily along with him. Mason said nothing, absorbing the humiliation in silence while Amelia watched, wanting desperately to defend him and knowing that doing so would unravel everything they had spent 2 years protecting. The moment stretched unbearably, Mason publicly degraded, Amelia trapped between love and the empire she had inherited, neither of them able to reach for the other in front of so many watching eyes. As the gala wound toward its end, Mason noticed Jason slipping out through a side entrance far earlier than his duties required, signaling briefly to 2 unfamiliar men waiting near the back door, their presence too deliberate to be coincidence, their patience too practiced to be ordinary security staff finishing an uneventful shift. Mason watched the exchange from a distance, careful not to draw attention, his pulse quickening with the certainty that something was already in motion that no schedule and no security memo had accounted for. He thought of the message Amelia had left unanswered, of the garage exit he had warned her to avoid, and a cold dread settled over him that had nothing to do with corporate rivalry. He moved quietly toward the service stairwell, intending to reach her before the evening ended, unaware that the clock had already begun running down toward something far worse than a gala scandal or a boardroom whisper campaign. After the gala ended, Amelia descended into the private garage beneath the building with Jason and 2 additional guards trailing close behind her. Jason reported, with practiced calm, that the main elevator had malfunctioned, forcing them toward a lower-level corridor with far fewer cameras than the route she normally used. Amelia felt unease creeping up her spine as she remembered Mason's warning from earlier that day, the words she had dismissed in anger now echoing louder with every step. She sent him a single character, a private signal they had agreed upon years earlier for moments when words were too dangerous to risk rain. Mason, still moving through the technical floor above, understood instantly what that single word meant. He dropped the mop without hesitation, pulled off his gloves, and ran for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time, every instinct from a former life snapping awake at once. Down in the garage, the lights flickered and died. The 2 guards accompanying Amelia were overwhelmed within seconds, a speed and precision that revealed immediately this was no random assault but the work of trained professionals. Jason stepped backward, feigning helplessness, his stillness in the chaos betraying exactly the role he had agreed to play. Xavier Cross emerged from the darkness for the first time, calm, well-dressed, nothing like the street criminals Amelia had imagined when she pictured danger. He addressed her by a name no stranger should have known, Mrs. Reed. The words froze her completely, the realization crashing over her that this man somehow knew about the marriage she had spent 2 years hiding from the entire world. Xavier explained, almost pleasantly, that he had no interest in ransom money. He wanted Mason to step into the light, and Amelia understood in that instant that she was not the target at all, she was bait. She fought back with sharp intelligence rather than panic, driving the heel of her shoe into one man's foot, tearing a security badge free from another's belt, sprinting toward an alarm column near the far wall. Jason blocked her path before she reached it. Within seconds she was forced into the back of a black delivery van, the doors beginning to close around her. Mason burst through the stairwell door a half-second too late to stop the vehicle, but not too late to notice a small symbol stitched into one attacker's glove, an old marking he recognized instantly from Xavier's network years earlier. In the few seconds remaining before the last man fled, Mason moved with a speed and precision that bore no resemblance to the quiet janitor everyone in that building believed him to be. He disarmed the man cleanly, efficiently, without wasted motion, the security camera overhead capturing every cold, deliberate movement. Evelyn arrived moments later, breathless, catching only a fragment of what had happened, enough to understand that the man standing among scattered debris was not who she had believed him to be for 2 years. Mason gave her a single instruction before turning to chase the fading taillights. Call the police, but trust no one from the new security team. As the garage fell silent again, Mason knelt briefly beside the spot where Amelia had been taken and picked up something small from the concrete floor. A wedding ring she had dropped in the struggle, the same ring she had kept hidden inside her pocket for 2 long years. He closed his fist around it, and for the first time since returning to civilian life, allowed the full weight of who he used to be to rise back to the surface, unhidden, unhurried, and entirely without mercy for whoever had taken her. Mason did not wait for the police, understanding that official procedure would move too slowly and could easily be manipulated by whoever Jason actually answered to. He moved instead to the maintenance room, opening a locked cabinet that appeared, to anyone glancing inside, to hold nothing more than cleaning supplies. Beneath the surface layer sat a secured phone, a folded map of the city, dark clothing, a compact medical kit, and a few small tracking devices, the modest preparations of a man who had once lived inside danger rather than the arsenal of someone seeking violence for its own sake. He called Hunter immediately, asking him to trace the delivery van through private traffic cameras across the city before official agencies could even begin processing the request. Hunter warned him that if Xavier truly stood behind this, the motive likely ran toward personal revenge rather than simple profit. Mason repeated Xavier's words the way he had called Amelia by her married name. Hunter went quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implication that the secret Mason had protected for 2 years had somehow already reached the most dangerous man either of them had ever faced. Evelyn called Mason shortly afterward, demanding an explanation for how an ordinary custodial worker had managed to disarm a trained kidnapper without hesitation. Mason had no time to answer fully, asking instead that she secure the garage security footage before Connor found a way to erase it. Evelyn began to understand, slowly and uneasily, just how deeply Connor's ambition had entangled itself in events far darker than boardroom politics. Connor, meanwhile, performed shock and concern before the assembled board, blaming the security failures on weaknesses he claimed had developed under Amelia's leadership, proposing she be temporarily suspended from her duties during the crisis. Lucas Grant arrived at the building within the hour, fury barely contained beneath his composed exterior, his daughter taken from the very building that bore his family's legacy. Connor attempted to steer that anger toward Amelia herself, suggesting she carried secrets dangerous enough to threaten the entire company's stability. Evelyn quietly preserved the footage showing Mason overpowering the kidnapper with frightening efficiency, watching the recording twice and understanding, with growing certainty, that the man she had dismissed as background noise for 2 years was someone else entirely. By early morning, Mason had traced the signal from a tracking device he had slipped unnoticed onto one attacker's jacket during the brief struggle in the garage. The trail led toward an abandoned warehouse along the city's industrial waterfront, the kind of forgotten structure where shipping containers gathered dust and old machinery rusted in silence. Mason stood at the edge of the security office, staring at the location glowing on Hunter's tracking map, and felt the last fragile wall between his 2 lives finally collapse completely. He thought of every careful choice he had made over the past 2 years, every decision to disappear behind a mop in a gray uniform rather than risk the world learning who he truly was. None of that caution had stopped Xavier from finding her anyway. The realization settled over him with a strange, painful clarity. Hiding had never actually protected Amelia. It had only delayed the moment when his past would inevitably reach her, leaving her less prepared to face it because she had never been allowed to fully understand the danger she had married into. Mason changed into the dark clothing from the cabinet, checked the small medical kit, and slipped the tracking device into his pocket alongside the wedding ring he had not let go of since picking it up off the garage floor. Hunter sent one final message before Mason left the building: "Whatever happens out there, do not let old guilt slow your hands." Mason read the words twice, then stepped out into the cold morning air, already moving toward the waterfront with the quiet, focused determination of a man who had buried this version of himself for 2 years and was now, finally, letting it breathe again. Amelia woke inside the waterfront warehouse with her wrists bound but her mind remarkably clear, the panic she expected replaced instead by a sharp cataloging focus. Xavier did not strike her or threaten her with violence, understanding that she served a far more useful purpose as psychological leverage against Mason than as a simple hostage to be harmed. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally, explaining that Mason had once dismantled an entire criminal network Xavier had spent years building, an operation built on kidnapping wealthards across several countries before one rescue mission tore it apart from the inside. Mason had not only freed the hostages that night, Xavier explained, he had walked away with data that eventually led to the arrest of nearly every partner Xavier relied upon. Xavier lost money, lost standing, lost the identity he had spent a decade constructing, and he had spent years afterward tracing rumors of a quiet, careful man who seemed to leave no trail anywhere. Only recently had he discovered that a chief executive named Amelia Grant had secretly married a janitor named Mason Reed, and in that moment he finally understood exactly where his old enemy had been hiding all along, buried beneath the lowest, least noticeable job available. Amelia absorbed every word, and something shifted inside her chest as the pieces finally fit together. Mason had never hidden his past from her because he doubted her loyalty. He had hidden it because he feared, correctly as it turned out, that the truth itself would make her a target. Xavier mocked her gently, observing that a powerful executive had apparently been ashamed enough of her own husband to bury him like an embarrassing stain on an otherwise perfect record. The words struck deeper than he likely intended, landing directly on the wound she had been carrying quietly for 2 years. Amelia answered with more steadiness than she felt, insisting Mason was not a stain on anything, that he was the finest person she had ever known. Xavier smiled and asked, almost lazily, why then did the entire world only know him as a man who pushed a mop down empty hallways? Amelia had no immediate response, guilt rising hot and uncomfortable in her throat, the accusation landing exactly where it was aimed. Rather than collapsing under that guilt, she turned her attention outward, cataloging the warehouse with the same precision she once used to study quarterly reports. The number of men present, the location of exits, the cameras mounted near the ceiling, the distant rhythmic sound of cargo ships somewhere beyond the walls. She was not a woman waiting passively to be rescued. She used every ounce of the strategic mind that had built an empire, deliberately playing weaker than she felt, feeding Xavier's pride and vanity to keep him talking longer than necessary, buying time while quietly searching for any opening, any flaw in his confidence she might later exploit. As Xavier continued speaking, savoring his own cleverness, Amelia's eyes drifted toward a row of high warehouse windows above them, and for one brief instant she caught the unmistakable shape of someone moving fast and silent across the rooftop outside. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face carefully blank, refusing to give Xavier any reason to look upward and notice what she had seen. She thought of every quiet night Mason had come home with that same controlled stillness in his shoulders. The stillness, she now understood, had nothing to do with exhaustion from mopping floors. Somewhere above her, the man the world dismissed as invisible was already closing in, and for the first time since waking inside that warehouse, Amelia allowed herself a single, fragile thread of hope. Mason reached the waterfront district alone, well ahead of any official response, knowing every minute lost to procedure was a minute Xavier could use against Amelia. He did not rush the building. Instead, he circled it slowly, studying patrol patterns, camera placement, the rhythm of footsteps echoing faintly through metal walls. Hunter fed him an old structural map pulled from archived city records, details that proved more useful than any modern security blueprint could offer. Mason noticed Jason's vehicle parked near a side entrance, confirming what he already suspected. The betrayal reached far deeper into the company than Connor's clumsy ambition alone could explain. He disabled one exterior camera quietly, then triggered an old, half-forgotten sprinkler system near a loading dock to create confusion without alerting anyone to his actual position. A single guard sent to investigate the malfunction found himself overpowered within seconds, subdued without enough noise to draw attention from inside. Every movement Mason made carried the unmistakable signature of a man who had once specialized in exactly this kind of careful, surgical infiltration. Patient, precise, focused entirely on protecting the hostage rather than settling old scores. Inside the warehouse, Xavier's phone buzzed, and he answered it without surprise as though he had been expecting the call all along. He told Mason to walk through the front entrance and face him directly. Mason replied calmly that Xavier did not need Amelia to find him. Xavier answered that he needed her precisely because pain delivered through someone loved cut far deeper than any blade. Amelia, listening through the speaker, heard Mason's voice for the first time since the garage, and without hesitation she spoke the words she had never once said aloud in public, that he was her husband, and she was not afraid. Mason froze for a fraction of a second at those words she had withheld from the entire world for 2 years, now spoken freely in front of the most dangerous man either of them had ever faced. He continued moving forward. Jason intercepted him near a narrow hallway, sneering that a janitor had no business imagining himself a hero. Mason answered simply that Jason had chosen the wrong people to betray. What followed was brief and brutal in its efficiency, no wasted motion, no dramatic flourish, only the practiced economy of a man who had trained for years to end confrontations quickly. Jason ended up bound with industrial cable, unconscious before he fully understood what had happened to him. Mason pushed deeper into the warehouse, but Xavier had already positioned Amelia near an idling delivery truck, preparing to relocate her before anyone could close in. Amelia, working a sliver of metal free from beneath her chair the entire time Xavier had been monologuing, finally loosened enough of her restraints to act. When Mason created a sudden noise to draw attention away from her position, Amelia kicked hard at a nearby electrical panel, plunging half the warehouse into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Mason moved through the dim space and pulled her away from immediate danger, shielding her body with his own as Xavier fired a warning shot that echoed violently off the metal walls. Mason used stacked cargo containers and an idle forklift for cover, working Amelia steadily toward the warehouse's rear exit while Xavier pursued, shouting that Mason could not save everyone forever. Mason answered that he had no intention of saving everyone. He only needed to bring his wife home. The confrontation reached its final desperate moment near the edge of the loading dock, the two men locked in a tense physical struggle above dark water lapping against old pilings. Xavier reminded him bitterly of everything he had lost the last time they crossed paths. Mason answered that this time would end differently, and after a brief, grueling exchange, he subdued Xavier completely, choosing to restrain him for arrest rather than settle the old grudge permanently. Sirens approached in the distance. Alerted by coordinates Evelyn had relayed the moment she confirmed the warehouse location from the tracking data Hunter had shared. Amelia rushed forward the instant her hands were free, wrapping her arms around Mason without a single thought for who might be watching, indifferent for the first time in 2 years to cameras, witnesses, or consequences. A photographer trailing the responding officers captured the exact moment Amelia Grant, blood and dust streaking Mason's collar, called him her husband for an entire city to eventually see. News of the kidnapping spread through the city within hours, and by morning every outlet had seized on a single irresistible detail. Chief Executive Amelia Grant had been rescued by a janitor who turned out to be her secret husband. Headlines twisted the story into scandal almost immediately, questioning her judgment, her honesty, and her fitness to lead a company built on her family's name. Connor moved quickly, calling an emergency board session before the dust had even settled, framing Amelia's hidden marriage as evidence of dangerous instability rather than simple privacy. Amelia walked into that meeting exhausted, bruised, and unwilling to hide for even one more minute. Mason waited outside the boardroom, reluctant to make things harder for her, until Lucas Grant personally insisted he come inside. For the first time, Mason stood before the board not holding a mop, but standing beside his wife as exactly what he was. Connor seized the moment anyway, sneering that no serious company could be led by a woman married to custodial staff, his confidence still intact despite everything that had happened the night before. Evelyn stepped forward immediately, laying out evidence she had quietly assembled over the previous 24 hours. Connor's payments to Jason, Jason's documented contact with members of Xavier's network, and a deliberate pattern of security gaps Connor had engineered to weaken Amelia's position. Connor's composure cracked instantly, insisting he had only wanted to force Amelia out of power, that he never intended for an actual kidnapping to occur. Mason spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm, saying that ambition without conscience had opened a door for something far more dangerous to walk through. Lucas turned to Mason and asked why he had accepted being treated as invisible for 2 entire years inside that building. Mason answered honestly that he had once believed standing in the shadows was the safest way to protect Amelia from the consequences of loving him. Amelia rose from her seat then, addressing the room with a steadiness that surprised even her. She admitted, without flinching, that she had been wrong, that Mason had never been a secret worth feeling ashamed of, only a secret she had been too afraid to defend properly in public. She did not apologize for marrying him. She apologized only for failing to protect his dignity sooner, for allowing fear of judgment to outweigh the respect he had always deserved. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Evelyn added one final detail, revealing that Mason had quietly flagged several secrecy vulnerabilities inside the building over the past 2 years, contributions he had never once taken credit for or mentioned to anyone. Lucas studied his daughter for a long moment before speaking again, telling her that true leadership was never about having no secrets, but about having the courage to take responsibility when those secrets caused someone else pain. Connor was suspended on the spot and referred immediately to investigators for his role in compromising the company's security and endangering its chief executive. As the meeting dissolved into stunned murmurs and hurried side conversations, Amelia reached for Mason's hand without hesitation and walked out of that boardroom in front of the entire leadership team, no longer caring who saw, no longer willing to let shame dictate where she placed her hand. Outside the boardroom doors, reporters had already gathered in the lobby, drawn by leaked details of the emergency session. Cameras raised the moment Amelia and Mason appeared together. Neither of them stopped to answer questions, though Amelia paused just long enough to meet the eyes of a few employees standing near the elevators, the same employees who had once walked past Mason without a second glance. Something had shifted permanently in that lobby, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between Amelia and the people she led, proof that the woman they had watched perform invincibility for years was capable of something far more difficult than confidence. Honesty, offered freely and without apology, even when it cost her control of the narrative she had spent 2 years protecting. In the days following the boardroom confrontation, Amelia faced a media storm unlike anything she had managed before, every outlet hungry for details about the marriage she had hidden for 2 years. She could have let her communications team frame Mason as a minor footnote, a quiet husband who simply preferred privacy, and let the story fade quickly into something forgettable. This time, she refused to let anyone reduce him to a footnote in his own story. Amelia called a press conference of her own choosing, on her own terms, rather than reacting to headlines written by people who had never met him. Mason hesitated before agreeing to stand beside her, uncomfortable with the idea of cameras and questions aimed directly at a life he had spent years keeping deliberately small. Amelia told him he owed the world nothing, that he had no obligation to prove anything to anyone, but that she needed to correct the record herself, publicly, in front of the same people who had once mocked him in hallways and conference rooms. At the press conference, Amelia explained plainly that she had married 2 years earlier, that she had hidden the marriage out of fear for how the industry would judge her, and that the silence had hurt the person she loved most. She offered no sensitive details about Mason's military service, describing only that he had once served in a unit dedicated to protection and rescue work, nothing more specific than that. One reporter asked directly whether she felt embarrassed that her husband had worked as a janitor. Amelia answered without hesitation that honest work never deserved shame, and that the only thing she truly regretted was allowing pressure and status to keep her silent for so long. Mason stood quietly beside her throughout, saying little, though something in his expression had softened in a way few people in that room had ever seen from him. Lucas Grant publicly voiced his support for his daughter in the days that followed, putting to rest any lingering doubts among shareholders about the family's unity. Evelyn was promoted to oversee a complete restructuring of the company's legal and security divisions, given full authority to rebuild systems that had clearly failed under Connor's quiet sabotage. Jason eventually cooperated fully with investigators, revealing the entire communication trail linking him to both Connor and Xavier's network. Xavier himself faced formal charges for kidnapping, extortion, and a long list of related crimes connected to his years of criminal activity. Mason declined every offer to become some kind of media symbol, refusing interviews and turning away requests to capitalize on his sudden unwanted fame. He also turned down flashy executive titles offered to him out of guilt or public relations strategy, uninterested in trading one kind of performance for another. Amelia suggested gently that he might consider leading a quiet program focused on crisis safety and personnel protection for the company, work suited to his actual skills rather than his recent notoriety, though she made clear there was no pressure attached to the offer. Mason said he would think about it, but that before anything else, he wanted the two of them to learn, finally, how to live as an honest married couple rather than two careful strangers sharing one apartment. That evening, Amelia reached beneath her collar, unclasped the thin chain where her ring had quietly lived for 2 years, and slid it onto her finger in plain view of anyone who happened to be watching. 1 month later, Grant Meridian Group had steadied itself, the panic of those chaotic days settling into something closer to ordinary life. Connor lost his position permanently and faced ongoing criminal investigation for his role in the security breaches that nearly cost Amelia her life. The board no longer had grounds to question her leadership, since the way she had handled the entire crisis, with transparency and accountability rather than denial, had actually restored confidence rather than damaged it. Amelia introduced new internal policies focused on dignity and respect for employees at every level of the company, determined to ensure no one else would ever be treated the way Mason had been treated for 2 long years. She required every manager across the organization to participate in a new culture training program, beginning with a simple, unavoidable principle: no one's value depended on the title printed on their employee badge. Mason no longer worked full-time as a janitor, though he kept his old employee card tucked into a drawer at home, a quiet reminder that worth was never determined by position or paycheck. He accepted a modest, low-profile role advising the company on crisis safety, deliberately avoiding any spotlight or formal announcement that might turn his past into a public spectacle. One evening, Amelia and Mason returned together to the 43rd floor, the same quiet hallway where he had once been treated as invisible by people who never bothered to learn his name. The corridor stood empty and still, lit only by the soft glow of city lights through tall windows. Amelia thought of every time she had walked past him there without daring to speak his name aloud, every small cruelty she had silently allowed to protect a career that, in the end, mattered far less than she once believed. She apologized again, this time without polished language or rehearsed phrasing, simply speaking the truth as plainly as she could manage. Mason admitted he carried his own share of fault, having mistaken silence for protection, believing that shielding her from his past somehow kept her safer rather than simply keeping her in the dark. Both of them understood now that a marriage could not survive if either partner kept hiding the other beneath the comfortable excuse of protection. Amelia asked whether he regretted those 2 years spent as a man nobody noticed, working quietly beside the life they shared. Mason said his only true regret was leaving her to carry so much fear entirely alone. They stood together near the tall windows overlooking the city, the distance between executive and janitor, between light and shadow, finally erased completely. What remained was simpler than either title had ever suggested: two people who had each made mistakes, who had each caused the other pain, and who had finally chosen, after everything, to stand beside one another openly rather than apart in secret. During a small internal gathering soon after, Amelia introduced Mason to the entire company, not as the man who had saved her life, and not as a former operative with a hidden past, but simply as her husband. The room fell silent for a brief moment before applause rose up around them, gradually filling the space where awkward silence had stood only seconds before. Mason, never comfortable with attention, did not lower his head this time, did not retreat into the practiced invisibility that had defined him for 2 years. Amelia held his hand firmly in front of everyone, steady and unhurried. In the end, the man who had once mopped floors in the shadows had done far more than rescue her from kidnappers in a waterfront warehouse. He had rescued her from the deeper fear of loving someone who did not belong to the polished, glittering world she had spent her entire life trying to perfect. If you want to discover exactly how that secret marriage ended up saving her life, stay until the very end.